Well, on the 5th of April 2013, the Prime Minister, now the Prime Minister, he was opposition leader at the time, Tony Abbott, in a speech to the IPA, his favourite organisation, the Institute of Public Affairs, it's the Rupert Murdoch, Gina Rinehart think tank, he had to say this: "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is the foundation of our justice. Love your neighbour as you love yourself is the foundation of our mercy." That was our Prime Minister when he was Leader of the Opposition. And now this government is engaged in what I think will be regarded as crimes against humanity, because it is systematic abuse. It is not one-off, not by any means. It is systematic, deliberate humiliation, degradation of people, and a deliberate and systemic process to destroy people's mental health. And that is what this government has undertaken and continued, and that is what we are talking about here today. The fact that there are children locked up in detention at all is a disgrace, and the Minister has the power right now to free all of those children and their families. But he won't do it, Mr Acting Deputy President. He won't do it because he wants to treat those children as pawns in a political game to try to get more power and more disgraceful legislation through this parliament. Now, what sort of a person, Mr Acting Deputy President, what sort of a person uses the fact that he has the power to keep children locked up behind barbed wire in detention centres and decides to trade or not trade their freedom depending on whether he can get other people to agree to give him more powers which are against international law? We would be the first as a nation to condemn other countries behaving in such a way. But here we are, Australia, doing it ourselves. There is a campaign that has started around the country saying, "Australia, we're better than this." And we are better than this as a country. And as you well know, Mr Acting Deputy President, under crimes against humanity, they are defined as odious offences, constituting a serious attack on human dignity and grave humiliation or degradation of human beings. And people can be held personally responsible for these crimes, and governments, and the threshold, as I said, is that if it's systemic. And so people who vote for these things need to recognise that this is more than just a political debate in the Australian Parliament. This is more than the Australian Parliament making a law. The Australian Parliament and people who make these laws will be held to account and should be held to account. I want to start with, there are so many things wrong with this legislation, it's hard to know where to begin. But the fact that Schedule 6 has in it that you can classify children born in Australia to asylum seeker parents as unauthorised maritime arrivals. No, they are not. They are babies born in Australia on Australian soil, and they should be regarded in the same way as any other child born here and given their citizenship, their statehood. But we are taking their statehood away from them. We are leaving them as stateless people. Now, what do you call this for treatment of pregnant women? There are 2 women, 8 months pregnant on Nauru, and they had been classified as genuine refugees. They had been settled refugees on Nauru. Settled refugees, not criminals, settled refugees. But because Australia has determined to send people to Nauru where clearly the medical facilities are not good enough, and they had to be sent to Australia to have their babies, they have been put in detention. 8 months pregnant, put in detention when they are settled refugees. Well, I call that disgraceful and grave humiliation of those people, and it's degradation of their human rights. They're settled refugees. They should be treated with the respect that they deserve, not shoved into detention. And the children are already in detention. We have had endless reports of the mental health stress of those children. They should be freed immediately. But to come in here and put up a piece of legislation that says, oh well, if you want those children to be freed, you agree to this other appalling set of provisions. And I want to go through some of those. I want to talk first of all about the minister's grab for power, that is, the removal of judicial oversight of the use of maritime powers. The fact that this bill will amend the Maritime Powers Act and remove judicial scrutiny of whether Australia complies with certain human rights obligations by removing a role for judges and removing a role for the courts to invalidate government actions at sea proves and provides that the rules of natural justice are not or do not apply to certain key actions, and it suspends Australia's international obligations in the context of powers exercised under the Maritime Powers Act. This is the Parliament saying that it will exempt itself, its behaviour, from the courts, from the scrutiny of the courts. I mean, this is absolutely shocking behaviour in international law terms. We're abrogating our responsibilities under international law, just so this minister can do what he likes on behalf of his government and every one of his ministers and every one of the crossbenchers who votes for this is voting for Australia to exempt itself from the provisions of international law for the sole purposes of the minister being able to do what he likes on the high seas. And why? Because the courts are catching up with him. That's why, Mr Acting Deputy President, the courts, the High Court is catching up with the behaviour of this government. So what do? Exempt themselves from the scrutiny of the courts. What a disgraceful behaviour from a government. But I want to go back to what this bill is also doing in relation to bringing in again temporary protection visas. 30,000 people have already sought Australia's protection between August 2012 and December 2013. They've already suffered. Physically and mentally, they've been locked up in mandatory detention, separated from their families, uncertain about their legal status and at constant risk of removal to Nauru or Manus Island. And on Manus Island, of course, they know that Reza Barati was murdered. And nobody has been held to account for that murder on Manus Island. And this government has tried to palm off responsibility to so-called service providers. Well, the responsibility lies firmly and squarely with the Australian government for whatever happens to people on Manus Island or in the detention centres in Nauru. Now, what this does is go way beyond the legacy caseload suggestion that the government has put here. It's a serious departure from Australia's international obligations under human rights, and it is procedurally unfair and unjust. And basically, this bill changes the criteria by which a person is found to be owed protection and the nature of the protection provided by Australia to those in genuine need. And it changes the legal status of those seeking our protection and empowers a range of government agencies to restrict or remove their liberty. I cannot believe that we are in this situation. You know, I have looked around the world in the past and I've asked myself the question, how is it that decent people who care about other people have allowed the atrocities that go on around them and have just carried on with their lives as if it wasn't happening. And I've never understood how it could happen. And now I'm standing in a parliament where it is happening, where people will happily go home for Christmas and sit up with their own families and make speeches saying, "Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you," make speeches saying, "Love your neighbours as you love yourself," and happily lock up people in detention, exclude Australian government actions from the courts, leave thousands of people in the mental anguish of never being able to settle in this country and wondering what on earth will ever happen to them in the future, happily go off, head off to church, talk about their Christianity, and yet fundamental Christian principles, fundamental decency, fundamental principles of humanity are being violated here knowingly and willfully. Because I also want to put on the record that whilst people will argue that they have no personal responsibility for the crimes that are going to be carried out as a result of this legislation passing, yes, they do. They can't say they didn't know. They can't say it wasn't willful. And they can't use any other excuse. Willfully and knowingly passing this legislation means that you are signing up to crimes against humanity. And it is in the Australian Parliament that people are doing it. And the rest of the world is going to be horrified when they look and see the detail of what it is that Australia is doing to people. I just find it extraordinary. As Save the Children has explained, temporary protection visas will mean people fleeing persecution are left in limbo, forced to prove and reprove they are refugees. The emotional and mental cost of such uncertainty is enormous and well documented. There is a body of significance of medical evidence which just shows the incredible detrimental effects on people's mental health. It is just disgraceful that this is being allowed to happen and that people are going to stand up and vote for it. But the other thing that's appalling is that it's allowing for fast tracking to occur. And to make things worse, under this fast track process, applicants for protection visas will no longer be entitled to have the merits of their claim reviewed by the Refugee Review Tribunal. In some cases, but not all, they will be able to have their case looked at by the Immigration Assessment Authority, but it won't involve any hearings where the applicant can set out their claims, and they will make a decision purely on the papers. And of course everybody knows that for refugees, for people seeking asylum, that is going to be virtually impossible because many of them are already frightened of the authorities because of the way that they've had to leave the countries they've been in. They will have no papers, no one to be able to justify in many cases or prove or verify some of the things that they are saying. This is setting up a grossly unfair procedural process. And you're doing it. You're knowingly doing it. You know, it is beyond my understanding of how you continue to use this Orwellian language. Unauthorised maritime arrival. No. Person. People. People like you and I. People with parents, with children, with brothers and sisters and families and hopes for a better future. People who've had to leave. People who've had to leave Afghanistan. Hazaras who've had to leave because they're being persecuted, and this government thinks it's fine to just turn them around at sea and send them back. Send them back to Sri Lanka, for example, where you know and I know that the Rajapaksa government is engaged in crimes against humanity all the time, and yet you appease them. You appease the Rajapaksas. You know exactly what they're doing in Sri Lanka. You know what they're doing to the Tamils. You know that the white vans turn up and people disappear, and yet you send them back because it suits you to do so, and what's more, give to the Rajapaksa regime some of the vessels which will better able them to intercept people leaving or to return them. You are more than happy to turn people around, traumatise the Navy, for example. Traumatise the Navy, as we saw on the 7:30 report this week, where people were horrified about what they've been expected to do, and they've been given no counselling or assistance because they are experiencing the humanity that they feel about seeing all of these people in the way that they are being treated. And the fact that anyone could say it would be inconvenient for a refugee vessel to turn up on Australia Day, so let's actually make sure that doesn't happen. Let's turn them around, let's push them back, let's do what we like, let's get rid of them because they're unauthorised maritime arrivals. No, they are people. No, they are people, and they are people of whom the Prime Minister has said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And it is very clear that he doesn't believe that. He wouldn't have his own family treated in this way. He wouldn't have a child of his own family left stateless. Every child has a right to a name and a nationality, a statehood. Every child in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, every child has the right to a name and a nationality. And yet you are taking that away from them. You are saying that child will be stateless, and what's more, we're not even calling a child. We're just going to label them in Orwellian terms an unauthorised maritime arrival. Well, international law will catch up with this government. The International Criminal Court was set up to look at systemic abuse by governments around the world, and this government will be and is in breach of international law, and everyone who votes for this legislation knowingly and wilfully supports breaches of international law and will be subject to the same scrutiny as they deserve to be in international law terms. So you can walk out of this parliament and think you've gotten away with it, think you've pulled some great stunt, and in another 20 years, of course, we will have the apology and people will tell their children that they had nothing to do with it, that they couldn't possibly have known. If they had known, that certainly wouldn't have happened. Well, they do know, and they are knowing, and they have done it, and they are making children stateless. They are making people live in limbo on temporary protection visas with no hope for the future and deliberately imposing mental health problems on a group of people. And they are deliberately exempting the Australian government from the law to enable the minister to do as he likes on the high seas. That is a disgrace. And I know that this government will rush out there and say, "Oh, we were doing it to free the children before Christmas." Well, a Christmas story has in fact Mary trying to get to the inn, you might remember, Mr Acting Deputy President, but the inn was closed, and that's why she ended up in a stable. Well, this lot are the innkeepers closing the door. So when you tell your Christmas stories, I hope you will explain to your own families that you are the innkeeper, you are closing the door. You are sending refugee women who are pregnant into detention, even though they are refugees. Settled refugees is the term. So let's actually have on the record here what this government is doing, and let's not have this being said, "Oh, we had to get the children out." The minister has the power to get them out immediately. The minister has the power not to put them into detention in the first place. They should never have gone into detention. They are being illegally held in detention. It is not illegal to seek asylum. It is wrong that they are being locked up and their freedom deliberately taken from them. This is appalling legislation. It is un-Australian. It is a matter of shame to me that this parliament will pass this legislation, but the future will ensure that justice will be done.